So, first off, I'd like to welcome you to the Greenwich Historical Society. My name is Anna Greco, and I'm the Curator of Education here. I'd also like to extend a thank you to Renee Ketchum and the Alliance Francaise for the wonderful refreshments. Please feel free to return and refill your plates at any time during the presentation. I hear the brie is amazing. Everyone wants to know where it's from. So I'm sure many of you are aware, this is the centennial of World War I, at least in Europe it is. And as a commemoration of this event, the Historical Society is currently having a show, Greenwich Faces the Great War. And it talks about the stories of Greenwich residents and what they did, even from 1914 all the way through 1919, to support the war effort. I would like to also extend an invitation for you to go down to the gallery after the lecture. It will be open for the hour immediately afterwards, and the admission is included in your program fee. One of the discoveries that we made during this research was just how much the Greenwich residents got involved in this effort. And today's lecture is about Anne Morgan and her ambulance corps that was very active over in France. But we also had our own local celebrity, Grace Gallatin-Seton, and there is a little vignette that focuses on her in the exhibition, so I would recommend going to see what she did. When we started putting together this exhibition, we were approached by the Alliance Francaise saying we had to do a partnership. And I have to say it has been an immense pleasure, and learning about really the connection here in Greenwich with what was going over in France has just been wonderful, and I'm very excited for this afternoon's program. So I'm going to welcome Renee Ketchum to come up and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, and bienvenue de la part de l'Alliance Française of Greenwich and the Historical Society. This is a great partnership, and as Anna just said, I got on the phone when I heard, and said we have to do something together. Partnerships are important. This is this lecture, American Women Rebuilding France, is a presentation by Elaine Uzan Leary, based on a traveling exhibition, American Women Building France, 1917 to 1924, focusing on the amazing response of the devastation caused by World War I in France, led by Anne Morgan, youngest daughter of financier J.P. Morgan. CARD, le Comité Américain pour les Régions Dévastées, was created by Morgan to aid the civilian population and helped rebuild war-torn Picardie after World War I. By 1923, over 350 American women had responded to her appeal and left their homes to come to the aid of the French people. Leary will share original photographs of the era from the Anne Morgan archives of the Franco-American Museum, Château of Blérancourt in Picardie, France. Now, a little bit of information about Blérancourt. It's currently closed, but will be reopening in 2016. And by closed, the gardens are still open. But it will reopen just in time for the 2017 American entrance into the war centennial. Born Elaine Vivienne Lheureux in Auburn, Maine, of a Franco-American family and educated in a bilingual community, Leary is a true Francophile. She's a graduate of Stetson University, University of Strasbourg, France, Middlebury College, Graduate School of the Chambre de Commerce in Paris, and Emerson College Graduate Studies. She has co-founded and taught at the School of the Alliance and co-founded and served as lead actress for the French Theater in Boston. Compagnie Bernard Uzan, Leary is currently Executive Director of the American Friends of Blérancourt, and I just gave you the update on that, which supports the Franco-American Museum, Château Blérancourt in Picardie, France. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Elaine Leary.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you so much, Anna. What a lovely welcome. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about what women have done during the First World War. It's something that intrigued me when I was first being interviewed for the position in New York. As you know, American Friends groups, there are many that support French museums. You've heard of American Friends of Versailles, of the Louvre, of Chantilly. There's quite a list. Blérancourt was the very first American Friends group, and this is a small museum located in Picardie that was founded by Anne Morgan. When I heard more about Anne Morgan's story, I became enthralled, and I was convinced we had to get the story out of what this American woman did to help the French following the war. In fact, she is so renowned in France that when you go to the region of Picardie, you see her name everywhere. And yet, here in the United States, very few people have heard of the work that she has done. So in keeping with the commemoration of the First World War, it was for us an opportunity to bring out her story through this traveling exhibition. We started the exhibition back in 2010 at the World War I Museum in Kansas City. We brought it to the Morgan in 2010, and hopefully we'll be bringing it back to New York City at the New York Historical Society in 2017. So we'll keep you informed so that you may have a chance to see this. You have probably seen on television some of the PBS programs, Apocalypse One, that talks about World War I. Or you may have seen the play War Horse, or you saw the film. We're beginning to emerge with stories about the First World War because the American public is not as familiar with the work that has been done by Americans. But for how much have we been told about the effects of the war on the civilian population? We hear a lot about what happened to the soldiers. But this is one of the reasons why Anne Morgan got involved in the first place. I'm sure some of you have seen Downington Abbey and have followed some of the stories of when the war began, the involvement of grand estates and people of privilege to really open their estates, to turn them into hospitals, and to give the opportunity for women to become very active. And many of these women were involved. Well, this is a photograph that is from Pachech, which is in Flanders. And it gives you an indication as to the tremendous horror of this war. But American women and men became volunteers very early on. The American Field Service, this is the actual ambulance, if you wish, of the American Field Service from the First World War, which is in our museum in Picardie. There were volunteers. Americans went over before the American involvement of the war to help transport these soldiers to hospitals. And the drivers were also women. The American Field Service, as it was called at that time, was based at Blérancourt, the chateau, which is now our museum. Another series of efforts were done in the medical area. Really, the American Red Cross grew out of the activity of these women coming over to help really the wounded soldiers. And who were these women? Where did they come from? How did they actually launch a women's movement, changing the role of women from a homemaker, housekeeper, wife, to an active leader in social issues? We talk a lot about Gloria Steinem. Well, Gloria Steinem, true, in a certain generation, was responsible for getting the awareness of American women liberation. But actually, the women's movement started way back at the turn of the century. And one of these outstanding women was Anne Morgan. The traveling exhibition from the Franco-American Museum Chateau de Blérancourt in Picardie has the photographs that I'm going to show you today, as well as the original film that was done in, of course, silent films in black and white. And it shows the work of Anne Morgan's group. Anne Morgan is so widely known in France, but she's virtually unknown here, except there had been an article that appeared in the, New Yorker from 1927 that said, regarding Anne Morgan, perhaps her outstanding characteristic is an amazing and inexhaustible vitality, working long hours for her cause. Most executives would be daunted by her routine. A handsome woman, tall and erect, a full figure, in fact, 170 pounds, a full figure. She strides into the campaign headquarters, followed by her dog, Randy, a West Highlander. Her entrance seems to quicken the air of the room. She does not fuss or flutter, but her energetic presence charges the atmosphere. Born July 25th, 1873, Anne Morgan was the youngest of J.P. Morgan's 4 children, John Jr., Louisa, Juliet, and she was the one that most resembled her father. She had his temperament, his talent, and his drive. She was bright, stubborn, imperious, and highly opinionated. And according to the biographer Ron Chernow, Pierpont Morgan could conquer the world, but he couldn't conquer his daughter, Anne. She was athletic, she was spirited, she enjoyed golf and tennis, and she also had style. Anne spent the first, well, here's Daddy. You can imagine what the conversations must have been like. She spent her first few years actually on Fifth Avenue in the home of the Morgans, which was right across the street from the New York Public Library. These buildings no longer exist. I got this photo from the New York Historical Society. But then the family moved over to the Morgan Library, where it sits now on Madison Avenue. The Morgans frequently traveled abroad and summered in Cragston, the family mansion on the Hudson near Highland Falls. Anne's wealth and position put her at the top of society, but she was not content to merely be part of a restrictive social tapestry of her time. Rather, she sought to refine the role and leadership of women with a bigger social vision. Her sense of scale and importance was similar to her father's, and he was a great philanthropist. Anne worked to enlarge the life and the role of her peers in New York first, as well as from those in the lower social backgrounds. In 1902, Anne was 29 years old, and she went to Chicago to see and study the settlement houses that were built by Jane Addams' organization. For those of you who aren't aware, Jane Addams was a lawyer, a dynamic woman in Chicago that really transformed the living conditions of all the migrants that were coming in to work. Once on location, she realized in order to help people, you have to be on location with them. She organized her friends to help with the most challenging issues of her time. Friends such as Elizabeth Marbury, better known as Bessie. Here was another important woman at the time. She was the American theatrical agent for George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde. Another friend, Mrs. Andrew Carnegie, and Mrs. Borden Harriman, chair of the National Civic Federation. The Women's Department of the National Civic Federation supported labor strikes, especially those of the women and the people in the garment district. And they lobbied for legislation for an 8-hour day, minimum wage, federal aid to education, and Social Security. Working with the National Civic Federation, Anne took over the supervision of the Navy Yard and its restaurant on Sand Street in Brooklyn. She helped to improve the conditions of the government workmen, and she succeeded so well, the restaurant made a profit. Anne worked to gentrify many neighborhoods, including the East Side, where she restored a building with Bessie Marbury, which now stands on 57th and Sutton Place, and it now is the home of the head of the UN. Anne was a natural leader, an aptitude for business, finance, and entrepreneurial skills. So she joined with Mrs. Harriman and others to form the first women's club, the Colony Club. And there it was a center for influential women to assess their roles, to meet together, discuss politics and social issues. It provided a safe environment for working women and many benefits that were usually only allowed for men, including a sports facility. Another one of her friends, Elsie DeWolf, who was the voguish former society girl and actress, then as now recognized as an extraordinary interior designer, had pioneered the new style of design, which was then brought to the Colony Club. Many independent women at this time were attracted to France. As foreigners, they experienced a more flexible intellectual and social environment. Bessie Marbury owned her home at the Villa Trianon in Versailles, and it soon became Anne's home away from home in France. And it was a magnet for a group of women that were to head up philanthropic efforts to save the French people during the war and then later after to rebuild their lives. Throughout history, we know that women have always contributed in their own war-torn countries, but Anne Morgan and her friends took these efforts to a whole other level. Their efforts were centered in Picardie. It's the province in northern France, for those of you who have an image of northern France, between Normandy and Champagne. And at the north, it touches Belgium, which is one of the reasons why this very rolling hill country, which is so beautiful, was perfect access for any enemy to get to Paris. A great part of Anne Morgan's efforts were really in leadership to rebuild the region for the civilian population and fundraising. The original photographs that you're going to see today, as well as the moving picture films that I have, were pictures and film that she commissioned to have done, to bring back, to show, and do her fundraising. I also found she had done a cookbook, and the cookbook had the recipes of all the famous people at the time, Mrs. Astor's favorite sandwiches, Charlie Chaplin's favorite soup, and it was brought back into publication. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. But she was selling the cookbook to raise money for her cause. She also stirred up New York by helping to raise money at a boxing match. And you can imagine a woman coming into a boxing match, pleading her cause and getting the money from the men. This was really quite scandalous at the time. But she had ingenious ways to really raise money. She also understood this new medium of photography and film was a way to really capture how awful the circumstances were in France and to reach out to people to encourage them to give money. In August 1914, Germany declared war on France and invaded via Belgium into Picardie in France. You're seeing the arrows was the direction of the army coming in. And let's see, I think there's a pointer here somewhere. Is that it? No. If you notice, I'll step away here. Here's Blérancourt, and here's Paris. So you get an idea of just how close it was. Blérancourt is actually 90 kilometers northeast of Paris. It's not far. So the Germans came through here. Anne happened to be in France at the time of the war when it broke out. And she started giving money to help the soldiers that were being injured. She decided she was going to go to the front to be sure that the money that was being sent was being actually used to help the soldiers. And there she found her calling. She saw the problems immediately and began to organize and rally her friends. This war to end all wars left 3 million Frenchmen maimed, a population suffering from starvation and disease. Their homes were smashed, their fields mined, and as a parting gesture, the German troops cut every tree and slaughtered every animal. And this is a region that, as you can well imagine, is very agricultural. All of their farming equipment was destroyed, and the fields were filled with mines. In Picardie alone, just in that region, 150 villages were destroyed, 12,850 houses leveled, 82 churches blown away, and 80% of the residents affected. The volunteer program in France attracted many, many privileged women who wanted to take on an active role in relief. She looked for women who could speak French, who could drive an automobile, and who could pay for their own way, Well, let's think about this in 1917. How many people, first of all, had automobiles? It was primarily the elite, leave alone know how to drive the car. Secondly, these women had to communicate in the language of the people, so they were highly educated, and they even paid their own transportation. They took the ship over. And there's a couple of photographs in the collection that are really amazing. You see them in New York getting on the ship with their hat boxes, and then they arrived to this. So it was a bit of a shock. Anne first established the American Fund for French Wounded with Isabel Lathrop to provide medical supplies to French hospitals and send parcels to wounded soldiers. She traveled to the front lines herself to check on the delivery. Maréchal Pétain, who was a great hero in the First World War, not so much in the Second World War, he really set up an operation at Blérancourt. Blérancourt is a wonderful old chateau that was built based on the Luxembourg chateau style. And it was totally destroyed during the French Revolution. The revolutionaries took all the stones to build their village and their houses. And so it was really a mess of ruins, but it was right smack in the middle of the action. So what he did is he had barracks built, and he asked Anne Morgan if she would come over and help rebuild the region because the devastation on the population was just horrendous. She loved the challenge, and she came and joined forces with, this is just part of some of the things they did. They were bringing rabbits to people that were living underground. Their houses were not built. They had really no animals to speak of. Rabbits reproduce quickly. They provide a little warmth, and le lapin is a delicious stew that French still love, as you know. These are also examples of the kind of transportation they were doing from village to village to assist the population. This is her partner, Anne Murray Dyke, who was a doctor from Canada. And with Anne, they created an organization known as the American Committee for Devastated France, which then became French-run and known as CARD, Comité Américain pour les Régions Dévastées. Well, since American women knew how to drive and speak French, they were able to not only repair their own automobiles, which they had to do, but also bring utensils, food, shoes, beds, books, rabbits. They brought everything to kind of rebuild the houses in that region. New community centers were created with low-cost clinics, libraries, schools, orphanages, sports, and children's program. Anne Morgan was particularly concerned about the status of the children. The first challenge was, first of all, to make them healthy. They were starving and they were very sick. And of course, tuberculosis ran rampant. In fact, there were letters at the Morgan Library from some of these volunteers who were saying they were just overwhelmed by the condition of these people, and they just couldn't work long enough hours to try to bring them milk and basic needs to help them become more healthy. But Anne knew that she had to focus also on the children, because the children, have any of you seen War Horse, the play War Horse? You know how you have the little girl who is traumatized by everything that she has seen? Well, imagine that all over this region. There were very few men. They were all gone to war, and the only ones left were very elderly. The women took all charge, and there were children, and these children lived under despicable circumstances. So Anne Morgan's group came into Blérancourt. This was one of the first arrivals. She came with 16 women, and what you're seeing is the archway of the Château de Blérancourt and the barracks that actually were built by the French soldiers to house the women so that they could carry on their work. What I'm going to show you now, I got permission to bring from the archives of the Musée de Blérancourt. These are actual films that Anne Morgan showed at her fundraising events and had them commissioned so that she could explain the circumstances. We're going to go through some of these because it gives you a different picture when you see it, moving picture. Life in the red zone, that was considered some of the worst areas. Well, these women were busy not only beautifying these barracks that they were in, but they set up really a base of operation. Anne Morgan was able to get automobiles from her daddy's friend, Ford. She was able to get donations from other friends. And you're seeing Anne right there, the bossy lady in the front that's handing out the directions and the information as to what they're going to do. She created the most amazing infrastructure where she was able to set up deliveries. She was getting equipment brought in to her, all these automobiles. She was able to bring in animals. I don't know how she got all these cows in from Normandy because this was going on. She started in 1917. You can imagine the condition. And here you see the very happy women. Some stayed for a month, some stayed longer, some came home sick. Others were just so touched by what they had seen that they were determined to rebuild this region. And so they would go door to door and bring in all of these materials. What I love in this photo, you see the woman cranking up the car. And amazing that they had to learn how to repair their own automobiles. This is what Picardie looked like. Total destruction. There was not a building left in any decent condition. And just look at the debris. Just getting rid of the debris itself was an amazing feat. Now, this was done with the aid of the French soldiers, because we're talking now 1918. And as a result, they were able to kind of help clear the way so that the women could come in and start doing classes. Anne Morgan had actually started a construction company, and she trained people on the spot to teach them how to restore their homes and their buildings. That construction company still exists today. So it's what we call sustainability in philanthropy. She set up programs across Picardie that are in existence today. And of course, you're looking at the peasant women. We're thinking about 200 years ago, but this is what they looked like in Picardie. And the idea that having no access at all to their fields or to food was horrendous. So she is showing how happy this lady is to bring home her beans and finally have some food to eat. Here's an example of the living conditions of one family. Those are just leftover stones that they put together as a protection. Now, Picardie is a little bit like New England. They have snow, it's cold, it's wet, and it's very muddy, as you probably have seen from all those French films about the war. So it's an area that is not comfortable to live in that kind of condition. But she began again by bringing in primarily animals. Now, this is a wonderful little film, and you can tell it's really made for PR. She did this to show, here's what our American women volunteers are doing to help the children in Picardie. And everyone loves books. Actually, she created the very first traveling library. So the mobile libraries of today were an outgrowth of what she did in Picardie because they had nothing, and it was a means of getting these materials to the children. You can imagine many of these children hadn't even been to school. There were no schools left. Many were illiterate, and it was, for them, the beginning of really an educational program. And this is really what Anne wanted most, to help the children, to make them healthy, and then to give them a sense of joy that they had lost. So here is the Bibliothèque Roulante, which is the traveling library. Now, there were some buildings, as you see here, that were in fairly good condition, but that was not typical of the villages. When you had one chateau that was in good shape, it was used as a base of operation. They're having trouble getting that into the truck, I know. It was really clever that she used film in this way. It was like newsreels. Before Charlie Chaplin showed his limelight, she had one of these films shown to show the condition and what they were doing, and asked Charlie if he would be willing to have the donation for that first premiere of his movie go back to help the children of Picardie. You'll notice that there are so many holes all along in these walls and buildings. Here's an example now of how she staged the photography so that it would give a message. There's one little boy that really likes the camera. She had schools. Isn't he cute? It's not over. She had built schools, and in fact, in the Franco-American Museum of Picardie, Blérancourt, there is the setup of what a classroom was like at the time. Very rudimentary, but of course for these children, you can imagine, they had really had no sense of enjoyment or education for so many years. There was, as you can see, a makeshift school that was put together. And there's still a lot of remains of stonework of probably previous houses. She had professionals that came. She had educators, nurses, doctors, a lot, in fact, of nurses and doctors. And really the joy of these women came when they could interact with these children and have a sense of hope. What you're going to see after is, remember, Anne Morgan was an athlete. She loved sports, and she knew that that would really put people in a good feeling. So she set up all kinds of games. She had set up races, which you're going to see after. There are still archery fields in Picardie that are called Anne Morgan archery fields. And she would bring them out there and have the young children, men and women, young boys and girls, really get involved in the sports. And she started creating festivals. Now, this was later, after they had been healed, fed, and had some assistance with their home environment. But look at the turnout. This is amazing. Anne Morgan never married, and she never had children. So this was her way of really fulfilling for her a sense of giving and nourishing for the young children. It's amazing to look at these images because some of these children are probably, 10, 12 years old? And just imagine, they're going to grow up to be young adults, and there's World War II in the same region that came back. So she got governors from all these different states issue May Day as being this special celebration. They have some really strange outfits, I know. She tried to bring a sense of Boy Scout to France, but that didn't quite work. People assumed it was a little too religious. So she just had the individual. There she is. You can tell her energy right there. And there's Dr. Anne Murray Dyke, who was in charge of all the medical. Anna, I think we can stop the film now.
What year was this produced?
These are pieces put together. They started doing them in 1919. Anne Morgan's group was in Picardie from 17 to 1924. So it was a period of 7 years that they did this. And so we have bits and pieces kind of put together. So after the war, Anne had helped 800 families, 2,300 people to become self-sufficient. Following the war, women continued their efforts until 1923. And there had been, as you heard, there had been 350 women. We don't have all their names. There is in the town hall of Blérancourt 2 big stone monuments listing the names of the original committee. But we know through letters at the Morgan Library and also through people that have contacted us saying, you know, my grandmother, my great aunt had done some work with a group called CARD. And that's how we're uncovering more and more of these people, which is really wonderful for all of us. Anne Morgan was awarded, of course, the Legion of Honor by Pétain for her outstanding work in France. And unfortunately for the people of this region, they were hit again by the Second World War. Anne received in 1935 an honorary degree from Russell Sage, a school that emphasizes the exceptional role of women in the world. Eleanor Roosevelt was a graduate and had come to Blérancourt to see the work that Anne had done. And at the time of the Second World War, she asked Anne to begin anew with a new committee to help out for the people in this region. She transformed the Château de Blérancourt, rebuilt the 2 pavilions. One became her home. The other was the beginning of the Franco-American Museum. And it became a very beautiful chateau with a new extension that was then turned over to the French government, and in 1939 became a national museum. So the Franco-American Museum Château de Blérancourt is the only national museum in France dedicated to the friendship between the United States and France. Anne Morgan never had children, but she left an amazing legacy. And it's one that we're very happy to be able to share with everyone during the commemoration of World War I. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Know that we are doing more and more research, so if any of you in this community have heard or hear about women that have families that may have been involved in this volunteer group, we found out quite by accident about Molly Brown, you know, the unsinkable Molly Brown. Museum contacted me and said, we'd like to do a joint exhibition. Molly Brown was in Soissons, which was the headquarters of Anne Morgan's medical unit. And when we brought the exhibition there, they had photographs of her doing the volunteer work. that is just the beginning. Wherever we go with this exhibition, we're finding more and more people that are uncovering in the attic of their grandmother photographs and really memories and letters of people that had participated. So you can see this was a big change for women. And all those independent women came back. And that had an impact, of course, on what they wanted to do when they returned to the United States. We are hopefully having this exhibition, as I said, in New York in 2017, and we'll certainly let you know, and we hope you will join us. Do you have any questions? Yes.
I'm going to ask you to ask your question into the microphone so we can have it for the video.
Yeah, I think this actually better be on a microphone because I'm so happy for this film and that you came to Greenwich, because I'm not sure that everybody knows here how many connections Greenwich had to Anne Morgan. When I was doing the research on the World War I, I ran into information at a local newspaper saying that she gave a talk at the YMCA, our Red Cross headquarters, in 1918 with films to our local people. I ran across a picture of Colonel J. Alden Twachtman, who was from Greenwich, and on the back it says, "In Anne Morgan's Garden," in 1918. I ran across letters in the war scrapbook of Major James H. Perkins, who was head of the Red Cross in Europe at the time, from Greenwich, referencing Anne Morgan, Mrs. Vanderbilt, and a number of other women who had done so much for the relief efforts. And of course, his Red Cross worked with them all the time. But we also have the William Rockefeller family, who were originally competitors, but then friends with the Morgan family, and were partners of Harriman. And Elsie Rockefeller was a co-founder of the Colony Club, and her father lived in Paris and helped the Paris effort. So you know all these people were talking together, and if we make these put these letters together, we'll have something. But then we have a Coscob Art Colony artist who learned to paint in the Coscob area. His name was Harry Ransom, I think. And I saw that he was one of the filmmakers for Anne Morgan in France at this time. He later became a sort of a medium-level filmmaker, some of whose films are still known. I also have found that ultimate tie to me is the connection between Anne Morgan and Grace Galton Seton. Anne Morgan, during the early 1900s, had her own little troupe of Indian girls. I can't pronounce the name because it's spelled 5 different ways in different newspapers. But they were invited to join the Seton Council that Grace and her husband Ernest would have every year of different Indian groups. And of course, they had the Woodland Indians. And there's a reference to her group being invited and coming. She didn't make it, but her group came and somebody else came. And so I know the Setons and the Morgans, particularly Grace and Anne, on the same wavelength. And when Anne Morgan shows up doing all sorts of preparedness activities, Grace has to be right in there with her. So I hope we'll find more ties, but there's plenty already to show that Greenwich was following and supporting Anne greatly.
Thank you so much for all that information. That's wonderful. I was certain that there were more connections here, so I appreciate it. Another question?
Anne Morgan was obviously a prominent figure in France, but I wondered whether she had any direct support from the central government or any of the provinces.
She was aided by the French government. In fact, as you know, J.P. Morgan had a bank in Paris, and she used that connection, but the French government really came to her aid. So many of these programs were joint efforts with the French government, but they didn't have a leader like Anne Morgan. So she basically set up all this infrastructure and then turned it over to the French. So there was a lot of collaboration, yes. Any other questions?
I think that Grace Seton also went over in World War I, didn't she, or am I dreaming? Mrs. Seton, yes. That would be...
Well, she probably was then active. There were a lot of groups that were volunteered in France. You had, of course, the Red Cross, but you had about 60 or 70 volunteer organizations that were all over in this region. So hers was not the only one. The importance is that it was the longest standing and the one that really created the infrastructure after. But but there were many groups. I'm just so impressed that these women would go there. When I first saw some of these photographs, and I know what Anne Morgan's lifestyle was like, I mean, this is awful. It was cold, it was sickly, it was overwhelmed with work. It was just really not a picnic to go there. And yet, there were several women that came back home and went back again. So it just goes to show, I think, that American can-do attitude. I've spent all my life promoting French language and culture, and now I'm promoting American philanthropy, which I feel strongly is really an important part of what we've done, not only for the arts, but for humanity in general.
It would be another set of studies, but with 350 women coming back to the States with this experience behind them, and the obvious sense that they could get a lot of things done, whether they were easy or difficult, presumably led to a lot of breakouts
Yes.
for women, one by
Yes.
one, and then groups of women and so
Yes,
on.
community services,
Right.
community centers.
Are you aware of any studies that dealt with that or tracked any of the individual women?
No, in fact, this is what we're investing in next, to do research to find out who they were, because we have names, we just don't know where they originated from. When we were in Denver at the Molly Brown House, we found out one of the photographs was a doctor, a gynecologist that had gone under Anne's group and then came back and developed a whole section in the hospital as a result. But the goal is hopefully to commemorate the entrance of the Americans in 2017, 100 years, is to be able to coordinate that at Blérancourt with at least being able to identify these women and what they did. That's going to be a longer struggle of a study, but I think it's very important. When I was in Atlanta, because we're going to be bringing the exhibition there, there is the nursing school that was created, and I'm trying to remember the name of the woman who was part of the Anne Morgan group. So we know a little more about those that were in the medical area, but Molly Brown was helping the miners in Denver. I mean, we only think of Molly Brown when you see the Debbie Reynolds film and you see her, the unsinkable Molly Brown. But she really was an activist in her own community, and I am certain that many of these women were, and they started up individual groups and libraries. Think of the libraries that have been started by volunteer organizations. So it's an interesting topic, and we hope to at least get some information.
Do you mind if I make a couple of quick comments?
No, of course not.
Karen identified all kinds of links that there are, and years ago my wife Liz and I were talking about family relatives, and it turned out that one of her relatives had gone to France and worked in a hospital with the wounded, and that at that very time my father was in the hospital recovering from wounds.
Oh, wow.
If one could somehow find all these links, it would be quite fascinating. The other quick comment on volunteering is, from the film, some of these women looked almost radiant, feeling really good about what they were doing. And they probably brought that back with them. And a joyful feeling does
Absolutely.
spread around a little bit.
Absolutely. I don't think it was all that joyous all the time, but for sure, it just shows, I think the film shows the energy that these women brought and a sense of joy. I mean, they really transformed this whole region. They were uniquely responsible for rebuilding Picardie. That's amazing.
I'd like to mention one boy who was involved. My uncle's two brothers enlisted right away when we entered the war, and my uncle, who was 16, lied about his age tried to get in, but he was caught and thrown out. And so he went to the Red Cross when he was 16 years old and became an ambulance driver on the Italian front. And several months later, he was standing in the King's Palace in Italy, and the King of Italy was pinning a medal for bravery on him at age 16.
16.
So the enthusiasm was quite incredible. Which is
Oh, it's
another story.
amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. There was a group of pilots that were volunteers because as you know, the Americans had not yet really built an army yet. It came as a result of this war. And there is a whole book called L'Escadrille Lafayette, and all the men were graduates of Yale and Harvard. They're amazing. Was your family from there? I'm seeing the lady point to you. All right. So, and there's a publication that lists all of these young men.
I think we only have one from Connecticut, though, Raoul Leary.
Okay.
Who was from Hartford.
Uh-huh.
I think he was the only Connecticut guy, but he did fly with Doug's father, and Doug's father's letters recount his death.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. So again, I think the volunteerism has always been kind of a sense, especially of that generation that were privileged. They were brought up to believe it was their duty to help those that were needy because they were not. And it was such a positive reaction on all the part. But I'm happy to be able to show you what American women did. We know what the American men have done, but we don't often talk about the women's role. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for joining us. Feel free to grab another piece of tart or brie on your way out. And again, we do have the gallery open for an hour, so if you're intrigued by some of the stories you heard today and Greenwich's involvement in the war, I invite you to go and see the exhibition. Thank you.
And I have for you at the door a little brochure on the museum, Franco-American Museum of Blérancourt. And also, this is a little brochure from our traveling exhibition. So you're welcome to take this with you on your way out. Thank you.